Hello, we have chapter 6 ahead of us, which is called Files and Exceptions, and both of these deserve a little bit of general discussion before going into the details that the chapter offers. First of all, there is plenty of ways to read from a file or write to a file, including the ones that are actually native to Python. We are going to consider only the most basic way of doing it. We will basically open a file, then use a loop to read line after line from this file, and after we are done reading it, we close the file. In some ways, in very basic ways, we will process the records, and after that, maybe we will write them. So we can write to a file as well. Again, opening it, then closing it after we're done writing. And finally, last but not least, we will learn to handle exceptions better. Exceptions are basically errors that happen when the program is executed, and some of them are unavoidable, like you are asking a user to enter a number and a user instead enters a word, and so far that would safely generate an error, and for example when we try to convert a word to a numeric, the string input to numeric if it was not actually a number. So this is a part where we will handle that, and by the end of this chapter, technically you will have all the ingredients needed to produce a final project, and that's something that you will be advised to start thinking about. Alright, so input and output. We want to write to a file, we want to append data to a file, and also we want to read from a file. So basically we need some way of communicating with a file. Typically a file is saved to a disk, or then the saved data can be retrieved from that file. So writing data to, it means saving data on a file in a file, and output file means a file to which the data is written. We can imagine looking at this, and before you try to fast forward to something else, make sure you understand that the data that will be written is stored in variables. So it's paramount that you are comfortable using the variables, defining variables, and then this data will be, in this case, written to variables. So we have, when we're executing our program, we have pay rate corresponding to some, basically, it's a pointer to some value. In this case, this is the value 18.65. There is employer ID, which is some sort of other value, and employee name, yet another variable. Exactly what those variables are and how we obtain them or define them is really not very important. It could be from user input. It could be from a different file. At this point, pay rate is equal to this, employee ID is equal to that, and employee name is equal to the third thing over here, the third string over here. And we want to put it on a disk. Alternatively, we would want to read from a file, and what does the reading in terms of programming means? That means that you are going to assign what you are reading to variables again, like the reverse process of what we had previously. For that, we need to open the file. Process the file means successfully, iteratively reading records from a file, and then closing the file. Close is important whether you are reading or writing, because if you forget to close the file, it may create some issues later. The most common issue when you are writing to a file using the API that we are going to see in a little bit, not closing the file means that there is no writing actually happening. So when you are writing your commands or write to a file, they are stored in a file object. And file object is actually written on disk at the time when you are closing the file. I will illustrate it later in examples. So yeah, reading data from the file. We have file on a disk which contains some records, and we would want to read those records, and again, and this is a key to understanding what's going on later, assign records to variables. And this, for all practical purposes, could be just one row in your database or one record from your file, and there can be plenty of them. So naturally, we would do it in a loop and update those variables accordingly. So we will eventually work with binary files, contains data that is just basically, you can think of it as binary zeros and ones. We will talk about it later when we talk about pickling. We will definitely mention that towards the end of the class. For now, we're working with text files, so our data will be encoded as text. And the extension for such files is txt, and I think throughout this chapter we will only work with txt files for reading and writing. There are, in general, two ways to access the data. That is sequential access. A sequential access means that you are reading a file from beginning to the end and you cannot skip ahead. And direct access, which is directly jumping by some form of identifier, jumping directly to the piece of data that you need. And we are not going to talk about direct access at all. So far we are talking about txt, and that is the files, and that is the file name extension that we will use. In general, there are different extensions and there are different formats, for example, for storing big data and for distributed storage. To use the data from a file and to be able to open a file and interact with a file, you will need to create a file object. So file object will be our variable. We'll refer to it as a variable, and I will show shortly how to create file objects, and that is what you will need to close in the end of interacting with this file. So in general, we will see that there is a variable name which will be assigned to the created file object, and the file object will provide a way for us to append, read, or write to a file or from a file. So open function is used to open a file. In fact, it is creating a file object. File underscore object is a name of the variable, which is now storing the file object. And we are creating it by open, file name, and mode. There are many modes. We will use R for reading, W for writing, and appending is A. The difference between writing and appending, writing will overwrite any previous information that was in the file, whereas appending is appending to the next line. So appending does keep the previous information. Now, if the file does not exist, this command will create it. And if there is no path, then it assumes, first of all, that the file is in the same directory as a program. And if the file does not exist, it will create. And yes, you can specify alternative file and file name in a open function argument, and you can look up how to do that. I'm not going to focus on that, so feel free to read documentation or online examples to learn more. Yes, to read, we will need to use mode R. And a little bit of a verbiage that you need to know, a new word, method. That's a function which belongs to an object. And in general, this is the object, whatever that might be, object dot write, and in parentheses there can be an argument for the write function. So file variable will be an object. We will work with objects a little bit later in the class, but you can recognize that we have been doing that all along. For example, we used turtle, forward, and distance. So turtle was an object stored in the module, and whatever forward was a function method of that object. So method is different from the general function. Method is always changing the object in place. So it doesn't create a new copy of an object. That's a way to change the object in place. And yes, in this context, we're working with a file. So we wrote something in this way, and in the end, we must close it. And when we close, then this is the moment when we actually write to a physical file. In the very similar matter we will read, and we need to read to know read method after the file has been opened, and the result is returned as a string. So read method reads everything altogether, the entire file, and stores it into memory for better or worse. Worse means what if this file is really, really large. And then there is a readLine method that is reading line by line, and this is what we will use for the most part. And yes, there is a way to find the read position, so basically to locate the next item. Okay, this is time for the first example. So we want to read from a file. Let's examine this carefully. In file, open fruit.txt. Notice the quotation marks, and the mode is R for reading. And the method that I'm using is just read. So in file is a variable which is storing the file object. So file object dot read will read the entire file. Then we will print this new variable x that I created, and then in the end always close your file. Let me show you that in what we have on the in the folder. So there is a file fruit.txt ready, and here is the file that I'll be running. So if we look at fruit.txt, we will see a list of just a list of fruits. Okay, let's go back and run this file. So the entire content of this file was read and printed. And I would pause a video and actually look at how many things are not great about this program and figure out what you might want to improve. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, so first of all, having everything in one variable is not very useful, especially when the file is long. You would have to parse this single variable x. Let me do a quick edit then. Okay, instead of reading it all together, we are going to iterate through the lines in the in file, in the file object. So for line in file, because in file actually allows this, it consists of really a list of it consists of iterable of lines, print line. The outcome will look about the same. Aha, so the contents are the same and you can notice an empty line in between. The reason why there is an empty line, let's look back at the fruit file. Here is my fruit file yet again. So file consisting of fruits. Okay, so in the end of this line, there is an end of the line symbol. And when Python reads it, it is also reading an end of the file symbol. So when the print statement works and it's printing a line, in the end of each line there is an end of the line symbol, and printing statement itself has end of the line. So one way how I could get rid of the end of the line symbol would be saying that end in the printing statement is nothing. That way only the end of the line symbol that is in the line itself, in the line variable itself, is kept. So that way we do better printing, but this is really not a good practice. So there is something to strip the end of the line symbol, and that way my line will be equal to rstrip actually I think it is line.rstrip and end of the line symbol. I will explain it in a moment. Let's see that it works. So like that, I delete both end of the line symbols and it will print in one line. Let's check that. Here we go, print everything in one line. And now I don't need this. This is a better program. Okay, so a word about what this is. So line is really a string variable, and string has a method rstrip, which means strip from the right. And what are we stripping? We are stripping the end of the line symbol. So that way our printout is more readable. Now kind of this program does do what I wanted it to do, read from the file line by line. That is more agile and more flexible than just reading the entire thing. So now if I wanted to do with each of those, to do something with each of those lines inside this loop, I could. Now let us think again what is not so great about this program. Here is the next improvement. I wrapped my code inside a function. That is very, very useful if this program is just a little tiny bit of some project, for example, your final project. That can come as a useful thing. Instead of main, you would have like a read function, and you will use it as needed to read from like your saved game or whatever. All right, let us run and make sure it still runs exactly the same way. Yep, it does exactly the same. And just for fun, as we are using a loop here, we can, for example, enumerate those lines. So instead of just printing the line, we can print a line and a number. And here I would stop a video and figure out how to do that. You know everything to be able to do that. Okay, I give you a few seconds to stop and actually maybe do it yourself. Think how you will do it. If you wanted to enumerate the lines that you read and, for example, print the numbers together with each line, and I assume you stopped and did it, so here is how you do it. So def main, same code, I added a couple of things. I introduced a new variable number that will be the number of the line. And inside the loop, inside the for loop, I also print number, then I print line, and after that I increment number by 1. So on every iteration, the number, in the end of every iteration, the number will be increased by 1, and here is enumerated version. So I enumerate starting from 0 because that is my choice. So 0 is apple, 1 is banana, and so on. 2 is grapefruit. And if you needed those numbers for any reason, hint homework, you can use these numbers.